I'm Will Beardsley at the Center of Process Studies, and we're interviewing Clark Williamson, Professor of Theology at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, on process thought. Clark, we'd like you to think with us about how process thought helps you to work theologically.
All right. First thing I guess I would have to say about it, Will, is that I became a process thinker a long time ago at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where I was working on, for me, what were the central questions of a theological journey. And that is, I was trying to figure out whether you could do theology with any integrity as a human being, morally and intellectually. And this also, of course, had to do with the question whether you could stay a Christian. As I'd grown up in the church, I think I'd really come to believe the gospel, and then I'd come to think that maybe the church didn't, because the church was racist. The church I grew up in. We're talking about before the civil rights movement, right?
Yes, sure.
And it asked me to believe stuff that I found incredible. So I had two fundamental problems with it. And I started studying theology at the University of Chicago in order to pursue the answer to the question whether I could stay a Christian with some integrity. And I began to find answers, I thought, to these questions in the theology of Tillich, which was the first theology I really seriously encountered. I had encountered a lot of philosophers and theologians in undergraduate school and appropriated a bunch of them in a kind of half-baked way, Whitehead included. But I didn't really understand, I don't think, any of these people. And Tillich was a source of hope for me, because I could do ethics with that. I could talk about justice and race relations questions and get involved in the civil rights movement and started following Martin Luther King on sit-ins, you know. And Tillich was very helpful, but it broke down. You know, I mean, you learn a lot about theology and how to do it from Tillich, and a lot of good ideas, but the ontology began to break down on me. And there were too many questions that were just too hard to try to figure out answers to. I began to appropriate, then under the teaching of Bernie Loomer and Bernie Maland, a Whiteheadian process metaphysics to replace Tillich's ontology.
It's a more adequate way of thinking in the modern world, I hear you say.
It's a much more adequate way of thinking, and I find it one that helps me address all the issues I want to address.
Well, along the line of what you were just saying, Clark, I'd be interested to hear you speak about how it helps you on the ethical front. You were speaking of your criticism of some of the traditions of the church on that score.
Well, what it does primarily is it gives you a backup for an ethic. That is to say, I think an ethic might have to be worked out down the line with the use of process resources and other philosophical, theological, ethical resources. But behind that, you have a meta-ethical question: is why be ethical at all? What difference does it make? And I, had this real problem of trying to figure that question out. If it doesn't make any ultimate difference, or any difference to the one who's ultimate, then it doesn't make any difference, and the whole thing is down the tubes.
Put it simply for us, Clark.
Well, I thought
why be ethical, according to a process point of view?
Because it makes difference to God.
Because it makes a difference to God.
Yes, that's the final reason for being good.
All right.
I mean,
that's it. That's what we're asking.
That's the final reason for being good. And I think process theologians often miss this dimension of Whitehead in the same, but they're so busy about putting down obedience to sort of external law, arbitrarily imposed, and regarding God as some kind of cosmic lawmaker. It's a bad thing, and it is a bad thing. There are more important things in life than that, but still, the God of process thought is a very commanding God. And this, I think, is something we've tended to forget, which is to say, let me unpack this a little bit. The initial aim around which any occasion of any moment of my experience comes into being is a gracious gift, without which this occasion of my experience would not come into being, right? So we got grace there. That's at the beginning. In my being, and then you can use Tillich's language, my being is grounded in God's being and all that. But this initial aim, which is the gracious ground of my being, is also an aim at the highest relevant possibility for my being. In some sense. Whiteheadians fuss about how to do the exegesis on Whitehead there, but it is an aim at the highest relevant possibility for my being, and in that sense it's a command. Or as John Cobb once puts, a call forward. But that's a moral impulse, right at the core of reality itself. And that, is the reason why the God of, I talk about the Whiteheadian God as a tremendum. Mysterium tremendum.
You're using Rudolf Otto's language of the Mysterium tremendum.
Not just fascinans, but if this were just fascinating and attractive, we'd all be so very good, We would have achieved all sorts of harmony and justice, peace. I mean, the Messianic days would be here, kingdom would have arrived. But this is a very commanding thing. The thing is, but you can't, limit it to a set of, given commands tend to become relative and passé because they get transcended and surpassed in this perspective. But that doesn't mean this isn't an incredibly commanding God. So and that helps me then really understand again, you see, what the gospel's all about. It's promise and command.
You want to spell that out a little bit, the promise side?
Well, the promise is the promise. I think the promise, what it comes down to, for me, is that we make a difference to God. That it isn't all just sort of sound and fury, a tale told by an idiot.
The promise is that we matter.
Promise is that we matter. That's right. The promise is that we matter, and then we can get on with it. Life is serious, but you can take it seriously without taking it gravely if you realize you matter. If you don't realize you matter, I don't know how you cope. But that certainly it gives you a way of backing up and warranting what it seems to me Christian faith is all about. So, you're going to have to say another question now, because I'm running out of, I'm getting tired here.
All right. I would only want to ask Clark whether you have given a lot of thought to the question of human beings and in the world of nature.
Well, I have given a good bit of thought to that, not nearly as much as other process thinkers have, because as you know, I've worked more on Jewish-Christian relationships and Marxist-Christian dialogue and things like that. But certainly, I think one of the great problems with the Christian tradition is the way it has regarded, or I should say disregarded, nature, especially the Western Christian tradition. I hear some things that make me think that maybe the Eastern tradition's better, but nature through the liberal and neo-Orthodox eras was just kind of staged.
Certainly was.
And history worked out on it, and we've learned from practical experience and ecological crisis and all that that's simply false and won't work. It has. There's something about process thought. We know, the whole business of the unity of human beings and nature and all that Whitehead talked about, the relation to the environment, that makes process thinkers, I think, the ones who are best, relatively better able to handle ecological issues.
Clark, let me ask you one other aspect of this question, and that is half the world is socialist, using the word in the broad sense. And we tend to polarize so easily as in our public rhetoric between the communist part of the world, as we say, and the non-communist. You've been interested in this dialogue, and how does process thought focus in on this range of issues?
Well, I think that there's no more Marxist book in a lot of ways than Adventures of Ideas, and it's a book and a perspective that enables one who utilizes a Whiteheadian metaphysic to appropriate Marxist insights critically, not to replicate them or be uncritical even of Marx. But Whitehead points out that change comes about, kind of change one wants to make in history, comes about as a result of the coalescence of two kinds of forces, what he calls the senseless agencies and ideal ends. And we see this, I think, often. His example is the combination of steam and democracy. Makes, the Industrial Revolution, steam, or liberation of people from all certain kinds of labor, greater efficiency, so forth, and democracy makes possible new kinds of changes. We Christians have the problem of sometimes thinking that we can moralize and idealize about things and that makes change. That doesn't make change. You couldn't end slavery, and Marx is, I think, absolutely right there, until you had the horse collar. Something had to pull the plow. You know, if you couldn't arrange it for animals to do it, then people had to do it. So you need technological development and ideal ends, morally approvable or proved ends for the kind of change that's desirable or good. You need both of those to make change. That's incredibly relevant to our age because we live in a kind of technological Eden where we got the senseless agencies all over the place and we have a listless moral relativism. It's sort of an easy relativism about ideal ends. In a very dangerous situation, I would think. We need to recognize that the Nazis had technology for wiping out people and could use it in the absence of the right kinds of ideal ends. So, you know.
So you feel that from a process point of view, we can come at those ends and get some meaningful connection between.
Yes, and we have at least a framework in which to think about these things that I think is helpful to be
which
to
is a supplement or corrective both to capitalism and to rigid Marxist socialism.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, mm-hmm. Quite so. Supplements. The two of them are more alike than anything else. I mean, it's hard to tell sometimes what you're talking to, especially in Marxist-Christian dialogue, when you hear the emphasis on production. I mean, it's hard to know whether you're dealing with a Marxist statement or a travelogue for Kentucky. You know, everything is booming and better.
Just give us a little word on what the alternative is to the production goal.
Well, I think one of the things, you know, there are lifestyle questions, which is one thing. We don't need to live the way we do, you know, that necessitates a kind of production for us to live that way. But more fundamentally, we need to learn how to develop soft technologies that aren't so brutalizing and so dangerous and so depletive of natural resources that actually regenerate and resources. We need to learn how to envision living together differently. The sorts of things that John Cobb talks about so well in the latter part of Christ in a Pluralistic Age, you know, concrete images of hope. I think, which Marxists would call concrete utopias. Some Marxists would call, you know, let's not talk about the far-off utopia. They make almost the same kind of point John makes. Let's talk about concrete utopias. How can we live differently? You know, what's some realistic images for hope? And it's interesting to me that it's process thinkers who can generate these things or appropriate them where other people generate them.
I hear you saying that the broad perspective that we matter, that our lives matter and our choices and the directions we take matter, that you get from process thought enables you to freshly to approach these ethical and public questions. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, that's a very fair way of putting it, plus the fact that all kinds of other process categories that you bring to them also are very helpful. It is the Marx that when I read Marx, I was quite struck that here's this guy talking about creativity. He's talking about human creativity, especially the young Marx. Well, he was quite a humanist, talking about creativity and how we get alienated from our own creativity by the ways we relate to one another. And then I felt like, well, here's the value being talked about here. That's the kind of thing Whiteheadians also talk about. And so why can't we find a way to appropriate this from a Whiteheadian Christian perspective, you know, without getting sucked into some of the other stuff that comes along, especially in the later Marx, in Das Kapital, where the earlier humanistic emphases seem to disappear or take a considerable back seat to more so-called scientific concerns.
More deterministic concerns and formal.
Ones, right, exactly.
And you're pleading then for a perspective which will hold in tension these contrasting elements rather than polarizing them and letting them fall apart.
Yes, that's right.
And that's one of the great characteristics of process thought.
That's right.
Thank you, Clark. This has been a very helpful perspective on some of the issues that you have worked with from a process point of view.
Thank you.